Wednesdays are for people's elbows, super kicks, and springboard cutters. You know what that means. It's the Drop the Mic Wrestling Podcast hosted by Michael Davis on Boom Broadcasting, and it's time to pick up that mic. This is the Drop the Mic Wrestling Podcast. We appreciate you guys watching us, supporting the channel of Boom Broadcasting. We have so much different content for wrestling fans, for sports fans, for TV show and movie fans. Sean, shout out to him having the most viewed podcast last week on Boom Broadcasting, over 300 views. So if you haven't had a chance, go check that out. And we're doing something special. We were supposed to do an episode last week, had some stuff come up with the fam. Everybody's okay now, but that prevented us from getting you your wrestling podcast fix. And so we're doing something a little different today. We're doing it on Tuesday at 3 p.m. And we will also be sharing a surprise at the end of this episode. So you want to stay tuned. But there was a pay-per-view this weekend. There's been a lot of mixed reviews. And so I'm going to share 3 things that I took away from AEW Revolution, starting off with the final match of the night, the main event. That's a weird way to start out, right? But no, it is. The main event deserved better. I hear everybody saying how the main event underdelivered this year, how that shouldn't have been in that spot. Maybe Adam Copeland shouldn't have been the challenger for Jon Moxley in a pay-per-view setting. And I want to tell you guys, stop. This match deserved better. Cope deserved better. Jon Moxley deserved better. And it was not them under-delivering. It was Tony Khan needs to know how to organize a match card. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. We're going to get into a couple matches that I think should have been left off the card. But when you look at AEW Revolution, it started off hot with Hangman Page and MJF. And then there were, Mercedes Moné, Watanabe for the TBS title. I'll tell you about that here in a second. And then it had Swerve and Ricochet, and that was a certified banger. And then you had Okada and Brody King, and you're like, okay. But then you had almost a snooze fest with the tag team title match. And then you stockpile back to back your best matches of the night. You have Timeless Toni Storm and Mariah May, which we will dive into here on the show. You have that bloodbath that I'm surprised it only went what's being recorded as 13 minutes. That doesn't even sound right. I need to double check the time on that match, but it was nasty. It was brutal. It was gruesome. You have Kenny Omega and Konosuke Takeshita in Kenny Omega's return pay-per-view match. You have Will Ospreay and Kyle Fletcher for that match delivered inside a steel cage. And then you have Jon Moxley and Cope in the main event. So obviously, if the fans are so gravitated towards the violence that Toni Storm and Mariah May had, and then they're just so emotionally invested in Kenny Omega's return and eventual win of the International Championship, and if they just watched one of the best wrestlers in the world today in his prime against somebody he has an infinite amount of chemistry with inside a steel cage where they did a Spanish fly off the top of the cage perfectly, yeah, it would be hard to follow that up. It would be really hard to follow that up. Especially when you consider Jon Moxley is usually the one in these death matches. He's the one who's the hardcore guy. So not only did you put Jon Moxley in a regular, normal singles one-on-one match, but you took him out of his element when other people got to do his element before him. He's 39 years old. And then you have Cope, who it can still go in the ring, but obviously he's not in his prime anymore. He's not Will Ospreay at his age. Cope is 51 years old. He knows how to tell a story. And if you've noticed Cope in his return, ever since he returned back in 2020 at the Royal Rumble in WWE, his matches have been less Will Ospreay. It's been less Kenny Omega. It's been less violence like we saw Tony and Mariah May have. His matches have become more articulate stories being interwoven. And if you missed this main event, or if you were just so much on a high of the previous 3 matches, you would have missed what happened here. Okay? This is 20 years removed from Edge, now known as Cope. This is 20 years removed from when he had WrestleMania 21, became the inaugural Money in the Bank winner, and would go on to cash in later in the next year and win his first ever world championship. Guess where that happened? The Staples Center. I will not call it crypto.com, but that is where this pay-per-view for AEW Revolution was. So 20 years later, he wins a ladder match, just hoping to one day be the world champion. There was no clear direction on terms of where to go with the Money in the Bank briefcase. But now 20 years later, he's in the main event for a world title, his first with AEW. And guess what? His best friend, who has the contract and has just kind of been there, automatically inserts himself into this match with the contract, and it's not Cope who gets pinned or falls unconscious. And so Cope doesn't eat the pinfall or the submission. Christian Cage does, but a stipulation that has made Edge the ultimate opportunist ends up hurting Cope in what was going to be his biggest moment in AEW. So if anyone's trashing on this match, you cannot blame Cope or Jon Moxley for the placement of the matches. You can blame Tony Khan for tiring out the fans for that match. Because I believe if you put any other match in between it, between Will Ospreay, Kyle Fletcher, and then Jon Moxley, Cope, people have time to rest and they can be fully invested into this match. Also, it was a 4-hour pay-per-view. So take with that what you will, even disregarding the pre-show festivities, if you will. They were just tired at midnight. And I mentioned, placing another match. And one of the matches that could have been on there was the AEW Tag Team Championships or the TBS Championship. But I want to go ahead and say these matches didn't belong. Now, pay-per-views used to be 3 hours. They used to be 4 hours. Sometimes companies would extend to 5 hours, 7 p.m. to 12 p.m. And what I've noticed in this generation is we get tired easily. We're not patient, so we don't give people the benefit of the doubt, but our attention spans are tough. You also look at what you have to do the next day. This was on a Sunday night. People had to leave the parking lot, get back to their homes, and if they didn't call off work the next morning, they were ruined Monday. And it showed up right at their doorstep. So 4-hour pay-per-views ending at midnight on a Sunday might not be the route to go. If you're going to do that, I would suggest do it on a Saturday when people have at least a few hours. Even if you go to church, they at least have a few hours to cope before going in at 8 a.m., having to wake up at 6:30, 7 a.m. in the morning. It's not feasible for an audience. Also, it's not feasible for the television audience. If you're watching on TV and you're just like, man, it's a drag. Like, when can we get on with this? And that's what they saw. Now, AEW, they've had issues. I don't want to bash either company because I think what AEW does well is different than what WWE does well. But there is one common factor. The audience you are trying to convey, some of them may like the stories WWE presents. Some of them may like the wrestling and in-ring storytelling that makes sense for AEW. And they both do a phenomenal job at that. But there is one common factor. People have lives. People have lives. And when you look at this pay-per-view, there's just some matches that you could have put on Dynamite. What are those? Mercedes Moné. Do you really think she was dropping the TBS championship to Momo Watanabe? Do you really think she was going to drop that match? And if you did, do you think it took 18 and a half minutes to decide who was going to win that match? You have Kazuchika Okada and Brody King. Now, I would love to see Okada in person. So I'm not going to fault them for putting Okada on the pay-per-view. And I'm not going to fault them putting on Mercedes Moné on the pay-per-view. But let's be honest. Did you think Brody King had a chance at winning the Continental Championship? It only lasted about 11 minutes, so I'm not faulting AEW for that. And then this tag team championship match. I mean, seriously. You got the Hurt Syndicate versus the Outrunners, who are clearly outrunning their time. I commend the filters of the 80s, and I commend the gimmick, I commend the character, I commend the wrestling attire and the presentation. But this was not a pay-per-view match. If you're telling me this is a pay-per-view quality match, you were trying to fool me. It just, I looked at that match, and as soon as I saw the graphic pop up, I was like, I know who wins this. And Dad's like, yeah, this is your bathroom break opportunity. And that match could have been inserted between Will Ospreay and Kyle Fletcher to help the main event a little bit. But why even have it at all? Because you take out the 9 minutes for Hurt Syndicate and Outrunners. You take out the 11 minutes for Okada Brody. You take out the 19 minutes for Mercedes and Momo. And all of a sudden you have 19 plus 9, that's 28, plus 11, that's 39. You almost, and that is without covering entrances or pre-packages, that cuts about 45 minutes out of your pay-per-view. And that might have helped the main event have as much energy as it could have. So I was very disappointed in just how the pay-per-view was laid out. But I don't want to be entirely negative because this pay-per-view had its great moments. I mean, Hangman and MJF. For the record, AEW says that they can't tell stories. Hangman and MJF. That was a story of MJF's insecurities. Like, Hangman burns a house to the ground and fans can still cheer for Hangman. But why not MJF? Why not him? They tell the story in the ring. Swerve and Ricochet, the Prince Nana robe. Prince Nana getting shoved down by Swerve, who's so invigorated by this hate towards Ricochet and wants to be world champion again. So he wants to win this number one contender match. And Prince Nana leaves. And Prince Nana comes back and he's able to get the robe. And then Swerve avenges Ricochet and attacks him. And then bows to Prince Nana as an olive branch, offering his robe. And we all go swerving while we drive as we leave that. You have Brody King and Okada. As much as I thought this could have been on Dynamite or even Collision, yeah, Okada and the match with Buddy Matthews led up to this for Brody King. I don't know the story for the tag team title match. I'll be honest. That should not have been there. But then you have Omega and Takeshita. The story of Omega coming back from diverticulitis, having 2 feet of his intestines removed, and he's able to come back against one of the rivals. It's Alpha versus Omega. Don Callis is there, and Omega's able to overcome and win gold again in AEW. What a tremendous story. And then Ospreay, Fletcher. Dude, like, they go way back. And Fletcher wants to be nothing like Ospreay, but he wants to be on his level. And guess what? When the two gladiators stood on opposite sides at the beginning of the match, on top of the cage, you knew as soon as they entered it, it was going to be war. And yes, it was. And Mark Davis coming down was a nice touch. And of course, Jon Moxley and Cope, Rated FTR, the Blackpool Combat Club, Christian Cage being inserted and involved, It was a story-written pay-per-view, but there was one match that told the story that was better than the rest. Jade Cargill is in WWE now, and her entrance says the Storm is coming. Well, let me tell you, the Storm left WWE years ago because of being mistreated. And you know what? Toni Storm has arrived, and her work as Timeless is timeless. I mean, her work has been incredible with the character. I was skeptical at first, but it's grown on me as well as the rest of the audience. And looking at this match, Toni Storm showed that she wasn't just, hey, let me get a pie shoved in my face. Very ruthless aggression era S for women's wrestling. And let me go carve my own path in AEW. And I am sure WWE is ruined the day that Toni Storm left because she has become a legitimate star. We don't know where Britt Baker is, if Dr. DMD will ever come back to AEW. And there's, Mercedes Moné, who is obviously a big star from WWE, trying to find footing there in AEW. But Toni Storm, elevated Mariah May, who you also see pictured here on the screen, and Toni Storm just elevate. I mean, this match was as good, if not better, than Swerve and Hangman's bloodbath back at Full Gear 2023. That's how good and how gruesome this match was with Toni and Mariah May. They both sacrificed their bodies for the entertainment of the fans. And Toni Storm wouldn't have gotten that opportunity in WWE, even in the Triple H regime. So let me tell you, if you can take anything away from Revolution 2025, it is that the Storm is not coming. The Storm is here, and it is Toni Storm. Now, a lot of people are talking about AEW and, how it's not the same anymore. And I almost beg to agree, because if you look at a year ago, I had the privilege of going to AEW Revolution in Greensboro, and I got to meet Wayne, which allowed me to meet Jason, and they've been a huge part of Boom Broadcasting. They're really good friends of mine. But I met Wayne in the line at AEW Revolution, and we were hyped. I mean, the card was stacked. It was long as well. But I'm going to read you some names, okay? I'm going to read you some names. I'm going to tell you what they all have in common. Daniel Garcia, Eddie Kingston, who decides to take to Twitter to air out his grievances, Bryan Danielson, Wardlow, Chris Jericho, Powerhouse Hobbs, Lance Archer, Hook, Brian Cage, Magnus, Dante Martin, Roderick Strong, Orange Cassidy, Claudio Castagnoli, FTR, Deonna Purrazzo, Samoa Joe, Sting, Darby Allin, and the Young Bucks. Do you know what all of those people have in common? They were booked 1 year ago in a match on the main card of AEW Revolution in Greensboro, and then they were not booked on the main card this year. Now, some of them did get on the pre-show, like Daniel Garcia, Roderick Strong, Orange Cassidy. They did get booked on the pre-show this year, but they were not on the main card. You know who also wasn't on last year? Who was on this year? You had MJF, you had Mercedes, you had Momo, you had Ricochet, you had Okada, who actually debuted in AEW immediately following that Revolution pay-per-view. You have Bray King, you have the Hurt Syndicate, you have the Outrunners, you have Mariah May, you have Kyle Fletcher, you have Cope. So, yeah, things aren't always the same. There's companies that evolve. If you look at last year's WrestleMania compared to this year's, you might see some differences. Why? Because there's roster turnover, there's storylines, there's injuries, there's releases, there's new signings. So, yeah, If you're expecting AEW to return to 2019, 2020, I'm sorry, you're sadly mistaken. But you know what? That's okay. That is okay because this is a company that is still thriving. It's still the second best company in the United States. And they're going to try to sell out Globe Life Park when they have AEW All In this summer. And it is allowing super talented guys like Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay and Konosuke Takeshita, Kyle Fletcher, and Swerve Strickland, like to have Hangman Page, MJF, to have a place on a show where, guess what? They can shine and they don't have to be buried on a very deep roster, which is a lot of what people are complaining about with AEW right now is their roster is too huge. But then when there's not a superstar being used or they get released, now we're okay. Why Tony released them? They were so good. They deserve a job. Hope WWE picks them up. There can only be so many spots on the show, or else you're going to be there till 3 a.m. on these pay-per-views, and ain't nobody got time for that. But that is AEW Revolution, a deep dive into what you needed to know. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it, I would go back and watch several matches. It was a great time, and it's a great time being on the Drop the Mic Wrestling podcast. And due to missing last week, we've dropped this episode at 3 p.m. today on Tuesday. But guess what? We're also going to be dropping another episode this week. And so if you have any enjoyment and entertainment, if you're a gamer with WWE 2K25, we're going to let you know everything you need to know later this week. Stay tuned to our socials to find out when that episode drops before the big release on Friday at midnight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching the Drop the Mic Wrestling podcast. And wherever you do, don't drop that mic. We will catch you here later this week for a new Drop the Mic podcast.